everybody, both those of you in the room and those of you online. Thank you to all of you for joining us, particularly those who have struggled through the ice and snow to make it to the room here in Westminster. I think this is the 5th year that we have published our annual report on education spending, and the 5th year that Luke Sibieta has been editing and running that process alongside a number of colleagues at the IFS, most of whom are sitting here in the audience. And as ever, it is a Bible for anybody interested in education and education spending, right from early years through to higher education. And astonishingly, Luke is going to try and run through the whole lot in about 20 minutes. After Luke speaks, we've got a panel of 3. We have Mark Lehane, who is a former head teacher, former special advisor in the education department, and currently working at the Centre for Policy Studies. Evelyn Ford, who hasn't managed to battle through the snow, I'm afraid, this morning, but is also rather busy as a head teacher in her own right. I met Evelyn when we were both members of the Times Education Commission. I know she'll be a great value. She's going to join us online. And then Robin Walker, who MP, who's chair of the Education Select Committee and was briefly a minister in the Education Department. So a fantastic set of speakers. I'm afraid Emma Hardy, member of the Treasury Select Committee, who was supposed to be with us, hasn't been able to make it because of issues with childcare. But before all of those, I'm delighted that very briefly Josh Hillman will say a few words of welcome and introduction. Josh is from the Nuffield Foundation. We are hugely grateful to them for funding all of this work. Everyone who's online, you can ask questions via the Slido app. As ever, you can vote them up, and I will see the ones that get the most votes first. So if you like a question, do vote for it. And obviously, people in the room are after the panel session. You can all ask questions. I will sit down now. You won't see me again until everyone else has finished speaking. I'm not going to pop up and introduce everyone in between. So Josh now, then Luke, and then we'll have the panel.
Can I just check, is this working, this mic? Do I need to press anything? Great. Thanks very much, Paul. As Paul said, it's 5 years now since we've been funding this series of annual reports undertaken by IFS, which provide a comprehensive analysis of how public expenditure on education is allocated across the different phases, how it's changed over time, and what's been driving those changes. And as I always say to anyone who will listen, this is one of our most important and influential initiatives in education. Whilst many of the issues and insights are long-standing that we see in the report that's launched today, the context this year is very different from previous ones and tougher, I think, than at any point in the series. Of course, when we launched last year's report, online only, so I wasn't able to see any actual faces, the UK was already bracing for the most significant increase in the cost of living in recent memory. But the invasion and war in Ukraine since February has obviously amplified that in ways that were not anticipated at that point. Inflation is affecting everyone, particularly at a time when it's predicted that we're going to be entering a prolonged recession. And as with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's those at the bottom of the income distribution who are most affected and have the least capacity to absorb that shock. But how is the provision of education itself being affected? Obviously, the pay awards for teachers and lecturers and nursery staff mean that they themselves are experiencing significant reductions in their standards of living. But beyond this impact on frontline workers, the cost of living crisis has had a major effect on the providers across all sectors of the education system. Schools, in relative terms, have been least affected, but I can't emphasize relative enough. Last month's autumn statement announced increases in school spending, ostensibly restoring some of the huge losses in recent years. But I believe that the persistent citation of the findings of previous annual reports that IFS have undertaken and the ability of IFS to get in the face of policymakers has contributed to that realization and that need for catching up on the funding. Now, whilst that additional funding is welcome in schools, they are still confronting significant uncertainty with their costs growing faster than overall inflation, soaring bills for energy, catering, buildings, repair, and challenges at the same time in teacher recruitment, retention, and supply cover, as shown by the head teacher not being here today. They're also dealing with ongoing task of supporting cohorts of children and young people in catching up on their learning and dealing with the mental health and well-being challenges that came from COVID, highlighted in other work that we funded, including undertaken by the IFS. All of this is inhibiting schools' ability to deliver a broad and balanced curriculum, extracurricular activities, and effective pastoral support for pupils. Now, if things are tough in schools, they're tougher for both early years education and childcare and post-16 education and training provision, where similar challenges are faced, but without the equivalent boost from the autumn statement. Meanwhile, early years providers have had to cope with increases in free entitlements, and many have shut down, and colleges and training providers have faced increased student numbers at the same time. Now, just finally, in my simple mind, there are three broad requirements of a good education system: resources, content and focus on curriculum and qualifications, and the quality of teaching and learning. And nothing is possible without the first of those, resources. So, as ever, IFS's annual report provides the most authoritative account of the latest data, the trends, and the challenges for both policymakers and providers in the coming years. My take home from the report, spoiler alert, is that these challenges can only compromise the standard of teaching and the standards of care and support being delivered to our children and young people. And they are ultimately the ones who lose the most from an education system that is receiving historically low levels of funding as a proportion of government spending. Really looking forward to hearing the findings being probed and discussed by such an impressive panel. And finally, I just want to highlight that as part of this programme of work, IFS are producing a range of additional shorter and more focused reports that are released in between these annual reports, and they're all available. There's a website address up there. It's become a one-stop shop on funding issues and challenges across our education system. Over to Liz.
Thank you all very much for coming, both those in person and those attending online. And thank you for the very kind introductions as well. And thank you to all the panel speakers for agreeing to speak at this event. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the main findings in the report. And I always like to give a punchline straight away so you can see what's coming. So the broad change to overall education spending has been that there's been a large cut to education spending since 2010. That's now gradually being reversed, almost entirely for schools, but less so for further education and significant higher education. At the moment, early years and childcare providers are facing very significant cost rises, well over above the level of inflation, particularly from increases in rents and energy prices, which is undoing some of the planned increases in funding. School spending is going to be back at 2010 levels by 2024, partly as a result of additional money in the autumn statement. So you could think of getting back to 2010 levels and no change in funding over 14 years as a relatively low bar, and they're still representing a squeeze on schools. Further education colleges and sixth forms probably are in the worst position, with only a partial reversal of the significant cuts they've faced since 2010, but also facing higher rises in costs, but no additional funding. But also seeing a big rise in student numbers at a time when department budgets are being reined back in again. For higher education, we've seen significant reforms to HE funding, and particularly in terms of the way students will make repayments with higher graduate contributions. But we're also seeing declining resources going into higher education as a result of many, many years of cash terms freezes in tuition fees caps. So to go over the detail, this graph shows the total level of education spending in real terms in the green line, and the level of education spending as a share of national income in the yellow line. Clearly, education spending in real terms has been rising over time, though differently over time. So there were a big rise in the 1960s, sort of constant level through to the mid-80s, then big rises from the mid-90s through to the late 2000s. Since 2010, there's been a real terms reduction in education spending, about 8 to 10% up to 2019. But it's important to, it's really important to show that official measures of education spending don't include the cost of issuing student loans, which is a big part of the way the public purse subsidises education. So in our annual reports every year, we publish figures including the cost of issuing student loans. This is what those dashed lines show. And that increases the overall level of education spending. When we look at the change from 2010 to 2021, we see about a 2% reduction in education spending. So some of the cuts that occurred since 2010 are now being reversed. Some of that is through sort of standard increases in education spending with extra school spending, extra further education spending. There's also a large part coming through increasing cost of issuing student loans, which some of it is down to perceptions of how graduate earnings will be changing in the future, increasing what we count as spending now. If we look at education spending as a share of national income, which is probably a good measure for looking at the relative generosity of spending on education spending in the long run, we see that it's about 4.6% of national income in the latest year, which is down from its high point to around 5.5% in the late 2000s, but a similar level to what we saw in the mid 80s and also in the mid 1990s. But it's relatively low in a historical perspective. As well as showing spending as a share of national income, it's also interesting to look at how education spending has evolved as a share of total government spending. So the relative priority government attaches to different areas of public services. So this very busy graph on the far side shows different areas of public spending as a share of total government spending. The yellow line is education spending, which was around 12% of total spending in the late 1970s, down to around 10% in the mid 80s, and then rose to around 12-13% throughout most of the 1990s and 2000s. It's now declined to around 10% of total spending. So it's close to its low point in the mid 80s. In contrast, there are other areas of public spending that have seen big increases in their share of total spending. So health being the most obvious one, which used to be around 10% of total spending, but is now well over 20% of total spending. And pensions has also risen as a share of total spending, though it's fallen very recently slightly. That's partly because debt interest has become a newly large component of public spending as well. And obviously there are good reasons why health and pension spending has increased over time. And that's partly because there is a larger share of a population who are elderly. So in the graph on the right-hand side, we show the share of the population who are age 65 or over, which has clearly been trending up over time and is pushing up healthcare needs and pension needs, which has gone up from around 15% of the population to close to 20% today, and will continue going up and putting pressure on age-related spending. But interestingly, the share of the population in education has also been going up over time. It fell slightly in the 80s as the size of the child population was going, but it has been increasing throughout from the mid 80s through to around 2000, and now remains at its kind of all-time high of around 20%. So we're now in a position where the share of the population in full-time education is close to is basically at its all-time high, and the share of spending devoted to education is around 10%, which is close to the lowest level it's been since the early 60s, if we extended this graph back in time. So a combination of a high share of the population and low spending is a surprising combination, is what I'd say. But an also crucial part of the context is the number of children in different stages of education, which is clearly the big driver of the spending needs. So here we show the number of children at different stages of education. And these do go up over time as the population and demographics change. So the familiar picture of the last 10-15 years has been the surging numbers of children in primary and secondary schools. So clearly primary schools started growing faster, secondary schools followed suit from the mid-2010s onwards. That sort of, and obviously it happened earlier in the early years, and so those children are working their way through the system. That population boom is now well over, and the number of children in school is going to fall significantly over the next 5 to 6 years, and is going to be the new challenge in terms of spending and funding needs. So between 2021 and 2030, the number of pupils in early years will probably fall by around 5%. The number of children in schools will fall by around 11%, or closer to 800,000 children, basically undoing the entire mini baby boom that happened since the mid-2000s, which will be a very significant challenge. For an individual school, a falling roll is a challenge, but having it occurring right across the system will be a systemic challenge. But obviously, because children take time to grow up and move their way through the system, the mini baby boom is now working its way through to the further and higher education system. So we're now seeing big growth in the number of students going into FE and sixth forms, which are growing by around 18% up to the end of the decade, and higher education student numbers, which will grow by around 20% up to the end of the decade. So we're now having this period of falling numbers in schools and rising numbers in FE. So it's important to see how the different parts of the system are playing out. And so now to take you through each area of education system, I've tried to part of the education system in 2 slides. So hopefully I do it justice, but there is more detail in the annual report if you want further information. So this graph shows total spending on the early years entitlement to now 15 hours at the university entitlement to 15 hours of free early education and childcare. And that level of spending has grown significantly over time, from around 1 billion in the early 2000s now to around 2.5 billion to cover the universal entitlement. And most of that increase in spending has been driven by extra hours, extra weeks of the year that entitlement has been available. But we've also been increasing spending on other parts of the entitlement. So introducing the new entitlement to free early education and childcare for 2-year-olds from 2012 onwards. And also the extended entitlement to 30 hours for children of working parents, which has driven overall spending to around 4 billion at latest count in 2021, which is a sort of 4-fold increase in spending on the entitlement as compared with 20 years ago. So most of the increase has been driven by extra entitlements to more hours, more weeks, to more children. But there has been an increase in spending per hour as well. So spending per hour of entitlement has gone up by around 28% in real terms since 2009. So whilst most parts of the education system have been seeing cuts, it's important to state that the early years has been kind of one of the areas where there has been increasing investment by both main parties over the last 20 years. However, they're seeing, as I said at the start, they are seeing very significant challenges, primarily through faster rises in their costs than their funding, and also the overall levels of inflation. So this graph shows the level of spending on the pre-entitlement and the different assumptions about prices. So in cash terms, spending on the early years entitlement from 2021 through 2024 was due to go up from around 3.6 billion to just over 3.7 billion as a result of increases in funding in the recent spending reviews. That's going to be, we previously thought the 2021 spending would be a small real terms cut in total spending, and that's shown by the sort of grey dashed line here. But that still would have been probably an increase in spending per hour because of the falling numbers of children. Since then, as is very familiar, overall levels of inflation have gone up, forecast levels of inflation have gone up. And if we focus on the sort of GDP deflator, which is sort of the main measure used for assessing public spending, that would show a faster fall in early year spending in real terms. But if we then also take account of the actual costs that childcare settings face, particularly in terms of rent, energy prices, food prices, increase in the national living wage, they're seeing faster rises in costs than overall levels of inflation. As a result, that's going to undo almost all of the increase in funding in real terms. So total spending on the early years entitlement will fall by around 9% in real terms between 2021 and 2024, and spending per hour will fall by about 3% in real terms. Moving on to schools, this graph seeks to illustrate the sort of roller coaster of funding that schools have been on over the last 20 years. So in the 2000s, there were some very substantial increases in school spending per pupil. So this shows spending per pupil on schools in real terms relative to its level in 2010. So as you can see, it was increasing up through to around 2009-10, where it reached its high point. Between 2009-10 and 2019-20, it fell by about 9% in real terms. Then at the 2021 spending reviews, the government provided extra funding to schools, which we expected would have allowed it to return to its 2010 level. But overall inflation then went up, and there were bigger settlements for teachers. So we then revised this to think that they wouldn't quite get back to 2010 levels because of high levels of costs. The government has since provided extra levels of spending to schools, with an extra 2.3 billion in the autumn statement. Based on general inflation, we forecast that school spending per pupil will actually be above its 2010 level by 2024, around 3% above it. And then even if we take account of the extra costs that schools are facing, both in terms of energy, food prices, increase in support staff pay, and increase in teacher pay, it will still be back at 2010 levels by 2024. But it's important to see the broad historical perspective that no change in school spending per pupil in real terms over a 14-year period is still a significant squeeze on overall levels of resources, particularly when expectations on schools are going up. Also, within schools' budgets, we know one of the biggest pressures on resources has come from pressures on teacher pay, and that's partly been one of the ways in which cuts to school spending have been delivered. So here, this graph shows the changes in teacher pay across the pay scale, both this year in 2022 in the green bars and in total since 2010 in the yellow bars. This year, most teachers will be seeing in real terms pay cut, because pay awards mostly fell below inflation. New teachers will see a small real terms rise around 1% because they saw a pay award around 8 to 9% on the way to achieving £30,000 starting salaries. But most teachers, higher points of the pay scale, will be seeing a 3% real terms cut. And that comes on top of real terms cuts in teacher pay since 2010. Indeed, the most experienced and most teachers are on this upper pay scale will have seen a real terms pay cut of around 11 to 12% in 2010. And that clearly makes it harder to address recruitment and retention problems, which have been long-standing in school, and some of the more recent data suggests they're becoming worse. To continue on the route of pessimism, so the area of the education system that's probably facing the biggest challenge at present, and we almost say this every year, is the further education and sixth form system. This graph shows the level of spending per student in further education in sixth form colleges in green and school sixth forms in blue. Colleges saw cuts through the 1990s, then increased in funding through the 2000s, and then saw almost the biggest cuts across the education system since 2010. And school sixth forms funding has fell even faster during the 2010s. Those cuts are now being gradually partially reversed as a result of extra funding in both 2019 and 2021 spending reviews. But even by 2024, spending per student in FE and sixth form colleges will still be around 5% below its 2010 levels. And in school sixth form funding will be around 20% below 2010 levels in 2024. And that obviously presents major challenges for further education colleges and sixth forms who are very keen to help deliver on a world-class technical education system. So colleges face major challenges, and indeed they face a range of major challenges going forwards as well. So they, like schools, early years, rising universities, they also face rising costs, but receive no extra funding within the autumn statement to help address this. They're now seeing their increase in student numbers at a time when department spending is being reined in, and because of the relatively low funding situation, they're only able to offer staff 2.5% rise in base pay this year. And that obviously creates problems for recruitment and retention in a part of the sector which is paid relatively less relative to teachers. And at a time when inflation is close to 8 to 9%, that's clearly a source of difficulty. If we look at spending on adult skills, sorry, apologies for going so quickly. I'm just keen to get through as many things as possible. So spending on adult skills fell significantly, but actually in the 2000s and also through 2010. That's partly through reduced spending on relatively low-level qualifications that governments have deemed to be of relatively low value. So since 2010, there's been a big fall in adult skills spending. There's around a fall of around a third between 2010 and 2019. The government has been increasing spending on adult skills since 2019, and that's partly through the restoration of public funding for level 3 qualifications, introduction of skills boot camps, and also the multiplier program. And so those factors are increasing spending on adult skills. But even by 2024, we still think that total spending on adult skills is around 20% below its 2009 level. But within that, we've seen that spending on apprenticeships has been sort of fairly constant over the last 10 years at around £2 billion. So that's been an area that's been increasing as a share of total spending on adult skills. But the numbers of apprenticeships has been going down, particularly since 2016-17 when the apprenticeship levy was introduced. So numbers of apprenticeships are down around 27% in 2016. Though within that, more people are doing higher level and degree level apprenticeships. But those tend only to be available to older workers and with less availability for younger workers and young people. The share of young people doing apprenticeships remains very, very low. Finally, with higher education, so as with all aspects of higher education, it's important to see the context and the historical context. So there have been significant reforms to the student loan system in February this year. So that includes a big drop in the repayment threshold, which will now be frozen at £25,000 up to 2026. That's a big cut compared with what previous policy would have implied, about around the threshold of £33,000. So students will be paying, as workers will be paying more towards their student loan contributions. The repayment period has been extended from 30 to 40 years, which is clearly extend the period at which they make repayments. And the interest rate has been cut from RPI plus 3% to RPI only, which will reduce the level of interest that those student loans accrue. The big change, well, not a big change, but lack of change, has been the continual cash terms freezes in tuition fees, which were introduced at £9,000 in 2012 and increased to £9,250 in 2017. But in all other years, that cap has been frozen in cash terms and has been committed to keep that cap up until 2015. And as a result, inflation has been eroding the real term values of these fees, with about an 18% drop in the real value of the fee cap over the last 10 years. And as I said earlier, there is a large rise in student numbers expected over the next 8 years, partly with the baby boom working its way through the system. And we expect there'll be a rise of around 250,000 or 20% between 2021 and 2030. And that's obviously a big increase in need for resources. So in terms of how the changes to repayments will affect students, this graph shows the level of expected lifetime repayments of students with different levels of earnings under different systems. So the pre-reform system is the green bar, and by and large, students with higher levels of earnings would have been expected to pay more over their lifetimes, with a fairly constant picture and increasing with level of graduate earnings. The cohort entering higher education this year would mostly be expected to pay more over their lifetime, and they're kind of like a cohort in transition because of the way the reforms were introduced. But the most significant effects are on those starting higher education next year in 2023. Higher earning graduates will pay less over their lifetime, kind of capped at around £50,000, mainly because of the effect of the reduction in the interest rate, and lower to mid-learning graduates will pay more over their lifetime, largely through the effect of the increasing the reduced repayment threshold and the increased number of years of which they make repayments. The other way inflation is affecting resources in higher education is the way it's affecting student maintenance loans. They've been increasing at a slower rate than overall inflation, which has been eroding their real term value. So maintenance loans are uprated in line with projected inflation, and actual inflation has been significantly higher than projected inflation for the last few years. As a result, maintenance loans haven't been increased in line with inflation, and there's no mechanism really to correct that. And so there's been a 10% fall in the value of maintenance support in 2020, which is the equivalent of about £1,000 less per year for the poorest students, which clearly affects the level of resources they have for their maintenance during their studies, and has now fallen below what you would expect as a minimum wage worker at that age as well, which is kind of a sort of a worrying difference. Drawing everything together, this graph shows the level of spending per student at different stages of education, all the way back to 1990. This is the graph we're able to draw through having done all the detailed work on individual stages of education. It means we can now compare and see how these changes have affected different stages of education over time. And the broad change is that the differences between the phases have been narrowing over time. So the early years was basically, well, almost was non-existent in the early 1990s. So that's come from nothing to now being around 75% of spending in primary schools. Primary schools spending has been increasing relative to secondary school spending, and secondary school spending has been increasing relative to further education spending. Higher education spending has and always, I think, always will go in a different way. So in the 1990s, when student numbers were increasing, overall spending was held constant, so spending per student just kept on getting eroded. Then fees were introduced, and that kind of helped stop the reduction. And there was introduction of top-up fees in 2006, which led to a big increase in resources. But then those fees are frozen in cash terms, got eroded in real terms, and there was a big injection of resources in 2012 with the introduction of £9,000 fees. And then we've seen another repeat of history with cash terms freezes in fees gradually being eroded over time. But kind of in a non-repeat of history, we haven't seen a big increase in fees to try and correct for that. But it means that higher education spending per student will be about back at the same level as it was in 1990 in 2025. So it's kind of a big reversal of the spending on higher education. And you can see these relative differences in an even more stark picture if we sort of draw a picture of level of spending relative to its level in primary schools. So as I said, it's around 75% in the early years. For primary schools, sort of it's been increasing and the big investment area. Secondary school spending per student used to be around 60% more than primary schools. It's now around 14%. That's kind of a change that's almost happened under the radar. They both spend more similar amounts now. Further education spending used to be 2.5 times the level of primary schools. It's now around 10-11%. So we basically spend very similar amounts on primary schools, secondary schools, and further education colleges. There aren't that big a differences as there used to be. But the big change has been higher education spending. It used to be 4 times the level of spending in primary schools. It's now around 60%, and we'll continue to go lower as a result of cash terms freezes in tuition fees. So that's a sort of very whistle-stop tour of change in education spending. And to finish and sort of summarise the challenges. So I think I've emphasised throughout that there have been significant cost rises for all education providers, but there's probably a biggest problems for early years providers, given that it's eroding the real value of spending on the free entitlement. Going forward, there's going to be fewer numbers of children accessing the free entitlement as the demographics change. That may allow a fixed pot to go further over more children, but it could also present demand side problems because you also do need a certain number of children to make a setting financially viable. School spending will be back at 2010 levels by 2024, but that's with big reductions in teacher pay. And as with early years providers, there will probably be problems for schools from falling pupil numbers. It may be that some schools are just not financially viable if they're only able to maintain class size to 2022, 2023, and we might think more carefully about the system strategically as a result. Further education colleges and sixth forms probably face the biggest challenge. They've only seen a partial reversal of cuts. Having seen the biggest cuts since 2010, they've received no extra funding for rising costs, and they're now seeing rises in student numbers at a time when department spending is more being reined back than increased. And finally, there have been some significant reforms to higher education funding over last year, but the sort of big picture of resources has been the declining level of resources since the introduction of £9,000 fees in 2012. And the reforms will increase contributions from lower middle earning graduates, but reduce them from higher earning graduates. So this is where I stop the overview, and I'll hand over to, I think we'll hand over to Robin first because he needs to make a call at 2, I believe.
Thank you very much. And
thank you very much.
Apologies, we'll have to step out of the room briefly at 2 o'clock, but hopefully can return shortly afterwards. Thank you, first of all, for a fantastic presentation and a fantastic piece of work in this report. I know the IFS reports have become something which is trusted and respected in the political and economic space in the way in which institutions such as the EEF have perhaps become in the education policy space, and it's incredibly valuable to have the detailed scrutiny that you provide. Having moved from being a schools minister, where the IFS report was sometimes a bit of a dreaded work, I have to say, to now being poacher turned gamekeeper and being a scrutineer as chair of the select committee, it is an incredibly valuable tool and really useful for us to be able to get into to get our teeth into. And we've moved from a situation, and partly thanks to the spending review, where at least in the school space, we've gone from a situation in which the IFS report is almost invariably quoted by the opposition and not the government, to one in which the government is actually quite happy to point towards it and the corroboration of a real terms increase in schools funding over the next couple of years. But as you say, only returning the overall picture to just above where it was in 2010. I think for me, the policy on and the detail of schools funding has always been a fascination. When I first got elected to Parliament, I spoke about school funding. I was very involved with the F40 campaign, looking at how it was distributed through the system and the arguments of fairness. I came to that partly as a result of visiting schools in my patch and hearing the huge pressure, particularly primary schools, I have to say, were facing in a largely rural county with pockets of urban deprivation, and recognising that that wasn't being effectively targeted. And so various initiatives like the introduction of the pupil premium have helped to move things in the right direction of that. But I think there's still further to go in providing a genuinely fair and rational funding formula for our schools. I was very struck by a number of things in this report. I think rightly it exemplifies the pressures that are being felt throughout the system. Particularly in the FE sixth form space, as you say, where those pressures are probably the most acute, but also in the early years, where whilst it's extremely welcome that the overall spending has increased in real terms. I think the calculation, I think it was on slide 30, that showed the higher rate of inflation that the early years sector has been facing, and the fact that that is so heavily driven by the number of early years professionals who are close to or on the national living wage, and with the big increases kicking in there, the real challenge that sector faces at a time when we're relying on it more and more. And I think of course, what you look at in the IFS is quite rightly the public spending on these areas. The challenge that often leads to is much higher private spending. And when we look at the early years and the challenge of childcare, of course, affordability is a key factor, particularly when we're facing a cost of living crisis more generally. So I think as everyone recognises more the value of what the early years can do in increasing children's abilities in making sure that they're properly school ready, there is a very strong case for continuing to invest more in that space. And I think the question that the report asks actually is, are the increases that we've seen to date really sufficient? I think there's also questions to be asked about, are the delivery mechanisms the most effective they could be? Gave the example of the amount that has been spent on the 2-year-old offer, which increased on that chart quite rapidly and then has come down a bit over time. That is the one of the offers that has the best take up across the piece. But the 3 and 4-year-old offer doesn't necessarily mesh and engage with it very effectively. You then have the whole area of so-called tax-free childcare and the investment that Treasury puts into that. So where the take-up is absolutely tiny and only around 20% compared to 72% for the 2-year-old offer. So I think there's a lot to look at in that space, and that's one of the reasons why I'm encouraging the Select Committee to take an interest in the early years in childcare and in the nursery sector, and look at a major inquiry in terms of that space. One of the things while I was campaigning to become chair of the Select Committee, a very good-natured campaign, I have to say, amongst colleagues, that David Simmons said, and I sort of more or less entirely agree with him, is where we spend money within the system is you wouldn't necessarily start from where we are in terms of where the money is targeted. And much has been made in educational circles about the case for early intervention over the decades. I do think that the pyramid of funding, it's interesting to see that convergence in your final slide between different areas. I do think I'm reminded of the famous Jesuit phrase of "Give me a child under 7 and I'll give you a man for life." But actually, spending money early in the piece can be a good thing, can increase children's chances. But one of the pressures that I think it's impossible for the IFS, looking at the numbers and looking strictly at the spending figures, to fully address. One of the pressures I see universally at every stage of education is the rising level of high and special needs amongst students. And that is also an area where I think investment in the early years, in early identification, in the right therapies that can support students to invest, to be able to engage in mainstream education is incredibly valuable. Now, I think the picture that you paint is tough enough already without recognising those additional pressures of having more high needs students across the piece. But I think it's another thing for us to think about in policy terms is how do we address that, when certainly anecdotally, pretty much every school that I ever visit will talk about meeting a higher, more complex level of needs, and the specialist sector within that has seen some inflationary increases in some of its funding, but not crucially in some of the areas like top-up funding, bears a really key part of the burden. So it's incredibly valuable when the IFS does this work and when you delve into the real cost pressures that are facing the system. I think it's something that we will want to take away as a select committee and analyse and pull apart. I'm already thinking of some questions, but I can be asking Robert Halfon about the adult skills budget tomorrow. He having done so much over the years to focus the committee on FE and skills. But I think the charts that you put in front of us are quite striking in that respect. So the main thing I have to say is thank you very much. I think it's a really interesting piece of work. I think it highlights there is some good news in there, and I think the fact that we do have schools funding on a better trajectory than it's been for some time is certainly welcome. But I think overall, the striking comparison that you make with health and that proportion of GDP which is spent on the two and the proportion of the population that they are focused on. Of course, we all benefit from health spending, but it is overwhelmingly driven, that increase in health spending, by a more elderly demographic. And the challenge in education, where you see more people in full-time education across all the age groups, but we see a lower share of government spending overall, I think is a challenge to us all to be able to make the case for education and continuing to invest there. So I hope those people who are listening from government recognise that the 2 billion, which was absolutely necessary for the school system, and that is just the start. And that other areas, particularly sixth forms, colleges, and the early years, will need more investment as we go forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. Mark, do you want to go next, and we'll come to Evelyn on screen last.
So I would like to echo what Robin has said about how brilliant the IFS analysis on education funding is. Genuinely, I mean, I'm not meant to talk about stuff that I was privy to when I was working at the Department for Education, but I don't think I'm giving anything away if I say that we did joke at various points that we should wear "What Would Luke Say" wristbands when talking about funding, and occasionally there would be a little high five when we thought that the numbers that were coming our way would pass the Luke test. But genuinely, the other really good thing about this report, and I would have said this a few years ago as well, is I started my teacher training 20 years ago. I'm a third generation teacher. I will always tend to focus in on schools because that's what I know best. And there's a lot of people who know schools best. So schools get spoken about a lot. What's really great about this analysis, it enables us to see all the different silos within the sector. And we get very silo focused, obviously, because it's what we deal with day to day. So to be able to compare what different parts of the education system are dealing with is really important. And I'm going to try and exemplify that by talking about the schools, the mainstream school sector first of all, and then what it's got me to think about other bits around that. So, there was a really good result for mainstream schools overwhelmingly in the autumn statement last month. They were asking for £2.5 billion a year extra to get back to that real terms 2010 per pupil funding. That's what they got. And also, we mustn't forget, compared to 2010, more of that money is going directly into schools due to academisation and the delegation of funding. But I know that when I'm talking to all my friends who are running schools or working in schools, and because I'm from an education background, most of my friends work in schools or around schools in one way or the other, it doesn't feel like the glory days of 2010 in terms of, I'm being flippant if I say, more money than we know what to spend it on. So I've been asking my friends, why is that? Why does it not feel like we're going to go back to an era of plenty? And I'm sure you'll have lots of suggestions. But when I'm talking to my friends, part of it is the distribution of funding is still not necessarily where it needs to be. There's possibly across the system in schools enough money overall, but not necessarily in the right places. Is it that because schools are now doing more stuff delegated to them, that they're perhaps not doing things at a big enough scale, so they're not quite as efficient as we were compared to some local authorities in 2010? Is it the schools are now doing more in certain areas than they were in 2010, perhaps because accountability is clearer, things around family support, attendance, wave to interventions and so on? And also, are schools having to pick up more stuff that they didn't deal with before due to other parts of the education ecosystem not being where we want them to be, stuff like CAMS and attendance and so on? I'm sure you'll have lots of other things you could add to it. That said, even though we're probably aware that those are challenges, being realistic, it doesn't feel like there's going to be a huge amount more money coming into the system anytime soon, whether we like it or not. So the question I'm thinking lots about, and I know you guys will be, and people across the sector will be, is how do we get schools to collaborate more closely in order to make the money they've got the resources, the expertise and so on into the right place at the right time for the right child, particularly around staff. The tight labour market, I don't think is going to solve itself over the next few months or years. We know, I know my 16-year-old daughter who will hate me for bringing her up, but she's in year 12. She's got a job at Tesco's, £10.20 an hour. She's 16. That is more than what a lot of teaching assistants were earning in schools. The support staff labour market around schools, and we know that some schools use a lot more support staff as opposed to teaching staff than others. That is changed. That is not coming back. That is really good for people in the labour market, but that means the cost of providing those support staff is up. Funding is not up to match it. So how do we make best use of that money and the staff in order to make sure we can get the right support in the right place at the right time for children? And my argument would be, and of course I've been banging on about this, it was in our white paper, it's going to be in the schools bill. I think therefore, pragmatically speaking, we have to encourage as many schools as possible to do the kind of tight-knit collaboration that you only get in well-run multi-academy trusts. Okay, I'm not saying that from an ideological point of view, I just think pragmatically that is the only way we can move. We can pool resources, pool expertise, pool staff to best support pupils and professionals within our schools. And the other reason why I think we probably need to do it is, and this report is very helpful for illustrating this, if we're talking about the marginal extra pound into the education system, there is probably a stronger case to put that extra pound or £1 million or £1 billion not in schools, but other parts of the system that schools and pupils rely on. I'm thinking mental health support. I'm thinking wider family support, children's social care. I'm thinking specialist provision, particularly special schools, pupil referral units and alternative provision, the high needs funding and that special needs system we know needs complete reform, and of course early years provision. So let's be clear, I'm not as an evil member of the Tufton Street Mafia saying schools don't need more money. What I'm saying is, in a very tight fiscal environment, if there's any extra money coming in, we will probably best be spent in terms of supporting young people and professionals going into the wider ecosystem around youngsters, not just schools. But of course, schools have the most well-developed trade unions. The school unions and schools have the loudest voices, right? I can understand why that is the case. The challenge, I think, for the school system now is to look at reports like this, to look at the wider ecosystem around young people. Can we start using the loud voices and influence that the school sector has to advocate not just for schools, but for children's social care, mental health support, wider family support, and of course, specialist provision? I don't know the answers. I'm just prompting some difficult questions. But when you look at that slide up there, it feels like the demands are hard on every part of the education system, but it's even harder on the bits around the child than it is in schools.
Thank you so much. Hopefully, we have Evelyn Ford online.
Yes, people can't see through my head.
Oh, there she is.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you. I've been listening intently to the speakers, and I'm going to talk. So I'm a head teacher in a secondary school in northwest London. I've got 900 young people that come from different demographics. We have our challenges. I'm also the president of ASCL, Association for School and College Leaders. So I feel that I can talk on two fronts, actually. I can talk from my own experience as a head teacher, every day, what I'm seeing and the challenges that we face, and also being able to represent over 22,000 school and college leaders. And I think my reality as a head teacher is very similar to many, if not most of our members. So I'm going to talk from a secondary perspective, but I fully understand the significant challenges as highlighted in the report for early years and post-16 education. I believe that the government's investment in colleges and sixth forms has been woefully inadequate, thus resulting in cuts to the curriculum and student support services. Much has been said over the last 40 minutes or so about the autumn statement, and that extra money for schools and high needs is obviously welcome, absolutely welcome. But as also mentioned, it does follow a decade of real-term cuts. And as the IFS points out, it still represents 14 years without growth in school funding, which, you know, for us at Askell in particular, it doesn't show a government that is ambitious for the future of children and young people. And as Luke mentioned earlier, the expectations on schools is not abating, you know, and I believe that, you know, career defining accountability measures, they remain a real issue. And I think the point made by Robert about the rising number of young people with special needs should also not be ignored. But if I can just talk a little bit about my challenges. So the 2.3 billion in funding, you know, how that's kind of cut across all schools, you know, if we do the maths for my numbers, we'll probably work out to approximately £170,000. But that will largely cover the cost of teacher pay increases, non-teaching staff pay increases, and energy increase in energy bills, and we're still yet to hear what's going to happen after the 6-month energy price cap. So for me, there are a couple of real issues here, and I know it's been touched on, but I really want to kind of unpack it a little bit more. And the real issue that I want to discuss is around teacher recruitment and retention. And this is a massive problem for the sector at all levels. We now have a full-blown recruitment and retention crisis, which is leading to significant staff shortages in many schools and colleges. I'm not convinced that going into a multi-academy trust is the answer. I think there are other ways, but we're in a crisis. And so I believe, and I think other school and college leaders feel the same, it will be impossible to sustain educational standards, you know, let alone improve them, without making investment in education far more of a priority. You know, how can it be okay for non-teaching staff to be able to earn more in their local supermarket than they can as a teaching assistant who provide exceptional care and support for our more vulnerable children? How can it be okay that teachers and non-teachers are having to use food banks? I've had to set up a food swap in my staff room because I know that some of my staff are really struggling. Teachers' pay is not keeping up with the rise in inflation, and it is driving good people out of the profession. The working conditions of teachers are also having a significant impact on retaining teachers. I have had at least 8 open vacancies since September. There is now no longer 3 recruitment windows. We've got one continuous one, which is costly, timely, and exhausting. And for me, there is a link between recruitment and retention and mental health and well-being in schools. And let me just give you an example. There was a recent well-being and mental health survey, and it found that 69% of teachers reported helping their pupils to process their emotions and talking to them about mental health. Now, I trained as a history teacher, albeit many years ago, and of course I can adapt and I can flex, but I genuinely feel out of my depth, as do other non-trained teachers, to support with suicide ideation, chronic anxiety, and other real challenges that our young people are facing. And for me, the government does not need to choose between prioritising children's futures or the well-being of school and college staff. The two are interconnected. As you know, for me, healthy and well-equipped teachers are better able to provide that high-quality education and support for young people who have been through an extraordinary, challenging number of years. So the pressures on school staff are driving them out of the profession. But let's talk to some facts, actually. The Department for Education has missed its target for recruiting secondary school trainee teachers for every one of the past 10 years, other than in 2020, 2021, when there was a temporary uplift, and that could be because of the pandemic. But this year, only 59% of the target was achieved in secondary and 93% in primary school. You know, we've got some subjects that are really, really struggling. You've got computing, only 30%. You've got design and technology, only 25%. We did a survey at Ascol in June of this year, and of the 766 state sector school and college head teachers, this is what they said about recruitment and retention. 95% have been experiencing difficulty in recruiting teachers, with 43% saying it's severe. 72% of these are using supply to cover for vacancies, 69% are using non-specialists to teach classes, and 31% said pupils were having to be taught in larger class sizes. It is a massive, massive issue. 92% reported difficulties in recruiting support staff, leaving many schools and colleges with serious challenges across their workforce. So in my view, we've got lots of issues in the sector, but the investment that we had recently will help, but it won't answer. It's not going to really address the chronic challenges that we're facing around recruitment and retention. The profession is now no longer seen as an attractive profession to be in. And I could go on, but in the interest of time and to summarize, in my view, the sector is on its knees. The cost of living pressures on individuals should not be ignored. It's driving superb people out of the profession. People are not coming into the profession because it's no longer seen as an attractive profession in terms of pay and working conditions. Schools are becoming the fourth emergency service, and that needs to change. We're not sleepwalking into a recruitment and retention crisis. We are in a crisis. And in my view, the government needs to act now, which will require a further rethink of government spending. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Evelyn for that great contribution. Thank you to Robin and to Mark, and of course to Luke. There's a lot of questions on Slido, but I'm going to give people in the room first dibs on questions. If you could say who you're aiming your question at. I'm not going to ask everyone to answer every question. And if Luke can't answer it, his co-authors who are super expert in the various areas are also in the room. Is there a question in the room? If you could identify yourself, sir.
Thank you. I'm Associate Editor of Education Journal, and I'm Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Teaching Profession, and also for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Pedagogy, Curriculum and Accountability, coming soon. I won't make the comments about the absent member of the panel trying to pretend that it was Loyola who first said, "Give me a child till he's 7," because it was really Aristotle, but I won't dwell on that. What I'm interested in, and this is for next year's report, is are you looking at the income, particularly to higher education, and are you looking at the regional variations, which I don't think, I've read most of the report, I don't think you mentioned, because I think that, and the other bit of work I do is with the Levelling Up Committee, and I'm just wondering, I don't see much reference to levelling up in your report, but perhaps I missed it. Thank you very much.
Luke, more to do.
Always more to do. So in terms of income to higher education, so one part of the report does look at the overall financial squeeze on university in terms of the level of spending. That's partly with reference to the issues with UPS and levels of spending in universities. But it's something we looked at throughout COVID and we'll be looking at again. In terms of levelling up and regional differences, We are hoping to do more work on that early next year. So we're hoping to look at sort of how spending across all the different stages sort of come together to affect the level of redistribution that goes on through the education system, both looking at the early years schools, FE, all together, because we've already looked at how differences there are in terms of spending by level of deprivation on schools. We'd like to bring together early years and FE all together, so we are keen to do more on that, and hopefully early next year, yes.
Is there one more in the room at the front here, and then I will go to Slido.
Thank you very much, Paul Swinney from Centre for Cities. Look forward to the subnational analysis for sure when you do it. I had a question on the early years spending, and that is no doubt public spending on early years. Do you have any feeling for what's going on in terms of the private element of that as well, and what that then means in terms of total amount of money that's been spent on early years? Because clearly early years is different to a lot of other areas of education spend in that respect.
So Matt, Christine, you want to take that?
Yeah, so I've been drafted in because my co-authors and I actually wrote a whole report on parents spending on early years provision, childcare provision, around about in May, also funded, I think Josh mentioned at the beginning, we have these kind of deeper dive reports. The upshot of that is it's quite a complicated picture, and it really, really matters what age group you're talking about. With 3 and 4 year olds, pretty much the free entitlement is by far the biggest game in town, which means that by and large, most parents aren't dipping too far into their pockets to fund their childcare. When you start looking at younger children, particularly 1 year olds, that's where things can get really quite costly. But even there's a really big difference between the sort of minority of families who are paying extraordinary amounts for their childcare, really, really struggling with those costs. But actually, it's only about a fifth of families who are using formal childcare in that age group who say that it's difficult to afford. And so and we've looked subnationally, there's a lot in that report. But yeah, I think it's a very, very nuanced thing, and that makes it quite difficult to give a top line other than to say very different experiences. A lot depends on the age of the child, and policymaking really needs to take that variation seriously if it's going to be effective.
Okay, I've got a question here from Slido, which I want to know the answer to as well. It says, if school spending is at 2010 levels and teacher pay is much lower than it was in 2010, where has all the money gone?
So I think this is an excellent question, and it's kind of it's kind of a question I've been having with the department and also with Mark more recently, and it to some extent comes back to economics 101 and how to measure inflation. And what would be a neutral situation for schools. And I think my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think CPI has been running faster than the GDP deflator over the last 12 years. And that meant that there have been sort of what seems like no real terms change in school spending per pupil, but it's kind of, because CPI, consumer prices are running faster, it will feel like a real terms cut to teacher pay per head. So the way school spending cuts have been delivered have mostly been through a combination of reductions in pay per head, and those are partly measured by a different measure of inflation, and also through larger class sizes. So I think to some extent sorry, I'm trying not to babble on economics. So I think to some extent the answer is that the cost of the same quantity and quality of teachers goes up faster than the overall level of economy-wide inflation. Because if you want to have the same quantity and quality of teachers, you basically need to match average earnings over time, over the long run, so that teaching still seems like a competitive profession. So I think the issue is that the money's been lost because it will feel like a bigger cut in teacher pay per head and staff pay per head.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Do you have a view on this?
Not as informed as Luke. And also I think the school contributions towards teacher pensions has gone up quite significantly over that time as well. I don't know if that's reflected in what you say about teacher pay. And of course, the people that will have most felt the decline in real terms teacher pay will be the people that have been at the top of the teacher pay scales for a while. If you're a young teacher working your way up the pay scale, you won't have noticed it in any way the same way, because your pay is still going up quite significantly every year. I think that a big chunk of it is that schools are now doing more. So pupil to teacher ratios have gone up since 2010, but not by as much as people might think they have, as far as I can tell. And they're still a lot lower than the average person would realise. It's 16.3 pupils per teacher across the secondary system, and I think 21, isn't it, in the primary system. And actually, the higher performing academy trusts tend to work on higher ratios than that, which I think is an interesting thing to drill into. But I think schools are generally doing more. And I don't want to sort of, I'm just going to use anecdote, and that's a terrible thing to use with experts like you around. But I know that when I started out teaching 20 years ago, some pupils would just stop coming to school and you wouldn't chase them in quite the way that we do now. I think we do a much better job supporting pupils. I think we're more aware of children struggling with their mental health than we were 20 years ago. And I think we therefore do an awful lot more for them, albeit not as much as we would like. And I also think that schools are trying to do a better job than we did 20 years ago, which is not to say that we weren't trying to do our best, just to be clear. And Evelyn, hopefully you'll understand what I'm saying there. I just think we think a lot, we think really carefully about the extra wave, what I call wave 2, wave 3 interventions. So not just what you do in the classroom, but how you follow up outside of the classroom, before and afterwards. Would you add anything? Evelyn,
Yeah.
to that?
No, I think I definitely echo that. I think what's being asked of schools, and it's not that we didn't care 20 years ago or whatever, it's just that the challenges are more significant, and particularly post-pandemic actually. And when I reference suicide ideation, that's a massive issue in many schools. And so, for example, at my school, I now invest in a counsellor. So we've got 2 school counsellors. When I joined in 2016, we don't have teaching heads of years. We have non-teaching heads of years, so that we can have that wraparound pastoral care. I think somebody mentioned earlier about CAMS. So the waiting list for CAMS is forever. So we feel that in schools, we have literally got to wrap our arms around our young people, because the services out there, that they just can't sustain it. We can't sustain it, but we're kind of doing the best that we can with the funds that we have. So definitely echo that we're being asked to do more, and a lot more high level as well, in terms of that intervention around young people's mental health and well-being. And staff as well. Let's not forget that we're also now thinking about how can we best support our staff with their mental health and well-being, which maybe we didn't do 20 years ago.
Great, really helpful set of answers. Thank you. I think there's a question here very firmly directed at you, Luke. Is there a danger the policy debate focuses too much on what is being spent and not the outcome and value delivered by that funding?
I think that's an excellent question. So our role here is more to show how money is being spent and how it's being distributed across the system and how that's changed over time. Clearly, it's much easier to deliver a higher quality of education with more money than it is with less money. But clearly, the ultimate effect on children themselves will depend on the quality of the decision making that happens within schools, within early years, within post-16, within higher education. That will have a big effect on the effect on outcomes. But they're kind of parts of the same coin as well.
And again, Mark, would you have a view on, how's quality changed over time? Do you have a sense of that?
No, because I've only got my own experience. But what I would say, and Evelyn, tell me what you think as well. I've only got 20 years of my own experience. The first 15 years in schools, and then the last 5 years doing policy stuff. There is no clear link I'm aware of in research between the amount of money per pupil and outcomes, certainly across strongly. Within this country, there are lots of different areas with different per pupil levels of funding, and there's no link between how those kids do in Bradford versus Bedford, which is one of the joys of getting towards a national funding formula, because if you like, it'll level the playing field there, won't it? It's what we're doing with that money that we know really makes a difference, which you've already said, and hence that for me is a challenge about how we create a school system and then the ecosystem around schools where we can properly be sharing. We tried this made a difference to these pupils that we can measure in that way, whether it's about mental health or pupil outcomes. And I think we're moving towards that system now, be it the National Pupil Database, the stuff you guys are doing about funding in and variation within that. That's the only way I think over time we'll be able to measure it. Evelyn?
if I heard right, we're looking at the quality of outcomes education in relation to spending. I think we will have a problem, and the problem, I'll talk directly to recruitment and retention, because how can we have those fantastic outcomes that our young people so rightly deserve when you can't recruit and you're using non-specialists in a classroom? That's going to, as much as schools are trying to support those non-specialist teachers, it will have an impact on outcomes. It will have an impact if we have to keep increasing class sizes. You know, I know some schools are already kind of merging classes because they haven't got somebody to teach the lesson. So you're using one specialist to teach a group of 55, 60, because, you know, it's better to have a specialist than a non-specialist. So in terms of longer term, I think there will be an impact on educational outcomes because we haven't got that high quality investment in the staff, and staff are not coming into the profession. So you've got a deficit, yeah, and people are leaving. So those amazing practitioners are leaving the profession. And if I talk to my first point, because it was really, you know, when I've got teaching assistants who, you know, morally driven, really want to be here for our young people, your most, you know, those young people with those really high needs, when they can earn more in your local supermarket, they've got to feed their family. So they're putting their families first, and rightly so, and leaving their profession. So that will also have an impact on the quality of provision and outcomes, in my view.
I think was there another question in the room before I return to slide 8? Yes, sir.
Apologies if this is a bit of a return to an earlier issue, but the community services that support schools that Mark mentioned several times, they've also been, I think, perhaps a massive reduction in recent years, as shown by one of your slides. Now, I don't know, I expect it's in the small print of your report, Luke, about what the Section 251 data you've included and what you haven't. But there are some important things that are not done by direct government or GFE grants that are done through the local government block grant system that have had massive cuts in services, I think have been very important to schools. And schools, perhaps quite sensibly, rightly, trying to replace those services out of their own funds when, you know, when Mark was talking 20 years ago, they could have relied on the local authority to have provide an education and welfare service to go and find out why children weren't in school, rather than getting the school office now keep phoning up to find out where those children have got to, and then thinking at the school level what intervention to make. But those services probably aren't, well, if they are there, they're not there in the same quantity that they were. I just wonder in the future reports, maybe you can try and quantify those services allied to schools that have actually reduced, so you want to get more of a total picture of what's gone on in the last 20 or so years.
I think that's a great question, and I know you know the Section 251 returns very well, so I can give you a very clear and precise answer that when we measure total school spending, we're including anything that's related to schools within the education budget of a local authority. And part of the reason why our measure shows a cut in total school spending of people is because local authority spending on those school services has fallen significantly over the last 13 years. I can't remember the precise figure, but it's around 50–60% in real terms. And that slack is is expected to be picked up by schools, particularly with regards to central services previously provided by local authorities. So when you look at an individual school's budget, you'll see it going up probably over the last 5 or 10 years or longer. But there are also higher expectations in terms of what schools have to do and spend themselves. And whether that's better spent at a school level or a local authority level, I personally don't have a strong view on, but and whether it's better to do it via MAT as well. But there probably does need to be more collaborative services in order to get better efficiency. But I think the other part of your question, which I think is implicit, is the kind of the effect of the cuts to things like children's services and children's social care, which schools are kind of almost explicitly and implicitly having to pick up the cost of. And so those cuts to children's services over the last 10 years will have put extra pressure on school budgets and high needs budgets as well. And so schools are having to pick up that bill as well as kind of the traditional picture of schools and education.
Great, thank you. We'll move on just in the interests of time. I'm going to direct a couple of questions now to Robin, since he's withdrawn us, and we'll move off schools a bit. Let me say, there's a question here: is now the time to prioritise 16 to 18 funding, but also is now the time to do something to get employers to do more, since the current level of employer expenditure seems to be a lot less than that in many other countries.
I mean, I think that latter point is very important. I do think getting employers to do more. We're going to be scrutinising the department tomorrow on the post-16 qualifications piece, but also on T-levels and apprenticeships. And in that space, what's been very striking is, despite the fact that T-levels being supposedly designed with employers in mind and with their participation, the number of employers who are supporting the T-level has decreased over the few years in which they've been in place. So I think there's definitely more that can be done on that front. In terms of the spending piece, I mean, I think the IFS makes a very clear case for where the post-16 piece has been faced even tougher reductions in funding than other parts of the sector, and the correction hasn't been as strong. So I think there is a case to make there. But I would come back to this pyramid of funding and actually say that I think, in terms of targeting funds across the piece, where you can potentially make the biggest difference is sometimes investing earlier and investing at earlier stages. So I'm not ideologically wedded to the idea that post-16 should be receiving more funding than other parts of the piece. I think there is an argument that it's faced such reductions, though, that there is scope for correction at this point.
Let me move on. I think a last question here, which I'm going to ask to the two sort of teachers present, about class sizes. I suppose the question is, should class sizes be made smaller? But I think I'd extend that to say, in your experience, is it better to, for whatever resource you've got, to have use that resource on smaller classes, or is it better to have bigger classes and give the teachers more time of their own and to prepare and so on? And what's your view from your own experience? I'll ask Mark and then Evelyn, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Should we let Evelyn go first, because I keep on speaking before?
All right, Evelyn, why don't you go first? Sorry, you're behind me on the screen.
Yeah, I would say teachers could always do with more time. There's been a lot of research in terms of, if you invest in your teachers around professional development, in terms of working collaboratively, sharing good practice across the school, then you'll get quite a lot from teachers. So I think bigger class sizes will have its benefits, as long as we've then got the time for staff in order to collaborate, in order to support each other, in order to go into each other's lessons, to see, to look at some observations and so on and so forth. But I don't think you can have one without the other, would be my view. I think invest in teachers' professional development, slightly larger class sizes, and with wraparound support from leadership, I think that could potentially work.
It's all about the team around the child and the team around the teacher that enables the kids to get into the lesson ready to learn and the teacher getting into the classroom ready to teach. So as a head teacher, you will look at the different needs of the classes you've got in front of you. And generally speaking, if the children have higher needs to get ready to learn, you'll want to have a smaller class. You'll want to maybe have more out-of-class support to get them in there. And then to counterbalance that, make it affordable, you will have kids that are more ready to learn in slightly larger groups. And so that, so that's why, for instance, if you set in maths, set one maths will probably be 32. And the idea being that your lower retaining pupils in maths will be in a much smaller class so they can get the extra support. It depends on the kids and it depends on the teacher. And that's why I think increasingly you hear trust leaders talking about the team around the child, but also the team around the teacher in order to get them in the best place to teach.
Evidence on this, Luke?
So the evidence keeps changing, I think is the short answer. So it used to be the case that the evidence on class sizes showed that that reducing class sizes didn't make much of a difference, but that's becoming more positive recently as we've been getting better data and better research designs and looking at wider outcomes. But I think the evidence is clearly stronger on high quality teachers that are well prepared for their lessons. Clearly, in a wonderful world, you want a high quality teacher with low class sizes, but I think the evidence on high teacher quality with decent class sizes is probably the best way to go with a limited budget.
And part of teacher quality is the support and the time and the preparation and all those sorts of things. So I think there's some agreement here.
I mean, just at one point, the demographic factors we're seeing flowing through the piece will, of course, mean challenges for schools in managing class sizes, and indeed for some smaller schools in continuing at all. So how they manage that and engage with it in a way which puts the quality of teaching first and foremost is going to be one of the big challenges, I think, for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing for next year, I guess, Luke, is even more of a focus on this adaptation to smaller cohorts and what we know about how that's been managed in the past and what we know about how that's best managed in the future. Very keen additional point from the room, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm looking forward to the poacher who's turned gamekeeper or whatever it is at the select committee tomorrow. T-levels are likely to fail in the way that diplomas were 10 years ago. Secondly, the feedback from T-levels and apprenticeships is that they are of very poor quality and are not meeting students' needs. And 3, employers refuse time and again to step up to the plate, as we've heard today. Employers are really good at telling us they don't like what the education service is producing, and totally hopeless at telling us and helping us what we should be producing.
Okay. Robin, I'll give you the last word then. T-levels and employers.
I think the aspiration behind T-levels is a very good one, but they need to be able to work better, and we absolutely do need employers to step up to the plate much more effectively than they are. I think it is a real concern, but we haven't seen the level of employer engagement which you would hope for, given that it was explicitly a programme that was designed with them in mind. So I think it is definitely something that we will be challenging ministers on. And I think more broadly, I just think this is such a crucial report for making the case for high quality investment in education. So once again, thank you to the IFS and to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting.
Well, that's a good moment to end. I mean, thank you. That last question on whatever happened to diplomas, T-levels and so on. One of the things that worries me most, having worked in the Department of Education 20 years ago, is just seeing continual cycles of policy, particularly post in further education, vocational education, post 16, post 18. Everything gets uninvented, reinvented, and then reinvented again, and doesn't get a chance to bed down. Whereas think of reforming A levels, and you can go half a century and more, and you can't make any change at all. So I think we've got a very imbalanced education system in terms of the consistency in some areas and the lack of it in others.
The current administration has destroyed the institutional memory of the civil servants and the DfE, quite deliberately.
Well, we won't quite go there. There's a limit, as I discovered on institutional memory. There was a limit on institutional memory across the civil service 20 years ago. I think it's an entirely new thing. What there also was, and I think people may have seen this wonderful video. This is not a go at Nick Clegg. This wonderful video of Nick Clegg 12 years ago saying there's no point in doing nuclear power because it won't be ready until 2022. But 2022, strangely enough, came along. You've got exactly the same feeling 20 odd years ago in the Department for Education. There's no point doing this research because we won't know the answer for 20 years. Well, 20 years has happened, and because we didn't do the research, we still don't know the answer. And I think actually that long-termism in education policy and elsewhere is so important. So thank you, Luke. But thank you also to Ben and Eddie and Christine and Elaine and Imran and Kate, who are all part of the education team, who are sitting here, part of the IFS education team, and who had inputs into this great piece of work. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for those online.